How true is it? Is it the case that technology kills distance? Well, quite simply, in testing this idea, I chose three cases that ought to be difficult for my sceptical counter-argument and ought to be an easy test for globalism. In other words, if it's not entirely true in these cases, then the idea might be suspect. And these cases are Al-Qaeda and the broader phenomenon of so-called net war, China-Taiwan, the prospect of a successful Chinese amphibious invasion of Taiwan, and the wider issue of the offence-defence balance and access denial in East Asia and Asia's maritime peripheries, and finally, disruptive technologies, particularly drones and cyber war. And in each case, what I argue is that while it's true that there are some shrinking effects, these are often offset by countervailing enlarging effects, and that at best this is a poor guide to the complex relationships not just between humans and geography, but also between technology and terrain. The distance is not simply a physical thing that can be measured by a ruler. Actually, it's created by a dynamic interaction between humans, doctrine, technology, and space. And that if that's the case, it can temper some of the threat inflation and suggests more prudent, maybe even more boring policy responses. And my policy responses, I'm warning you now, are extremely boring and middle ground and not very Cato in that sense. To talk briefly about Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda are supposedly the global guerrillas, the spearhead of a new breed of fighter, using the tools of the information age to devastate, outflank, and elude their more backward, more dinosaur state adversaries. And with the coming of the internet, it's been feared by a lot of globalists that Al-Qaeda has got hold of a virtual sanctuary, a platform online for both educating others in the dark arts of terrorism and as a platform for incitement. But what I try and argue is that Al-Qaeda, if you go through it carefully, is still substantially constrained by distance and in two ways. Firstly, it suffered the fate of arousing the hostility of its enemies. It got attention, and that in itself made it harder to operate in the way it's been operating. Once you hit a certain point on the radar, space can change alarmingly and dangerously around you, and that its adversaries' countermeasures, not all of them wise, have helped to stretch the gap strategically so that there's lots of irregular and guerrilla violence around the world, but complex mass casualty terrorism over a far range is much harder to carry out against Western heartlands. Secondly, Al-Qaeda's main move after 9/11, which was to scatter and to disperse and to decentralize into a network, to separate itself across the world into a network, this was widely hailed as a genius move that made it a kind of virtual post-geographical enemy. But actually, that in itself came at great costs. It helped to fragment its jihad. It made it much harder to direct and strategize its own war against what it called the far enemy. And the real issue here is whether or not, and John Mueller, I'm stealing John Mueller's phrases here in the audience, was whether 9/11 was a harbinger or an aberration, whether it was the pattern of things to come, or actually a violent and distressing but aberrant thing that actually didn't set a signpost for the future. Some interpreted 9/11 as proof of the borderless and globalist deadliness of terrorist networks. And advocates of rollback, that is, actually going on a vast multi-theatre effort, not only to disrupt a terrorist network, but to transform other countries politically to make it impossible for those networks to thrive, often spoke during debate as though there were a straight line between sanctuaries in the Third World, Afghanistan, and Western heartlands in Manhattan and Washington, DC. And that actually is simply not the case. That this is very problematic of a direct pathway. Actually, Al-Qaeda, like any other strategic organization, relies upon an intricate train of logistical links, forward operating bases, if you like. The plot against the United States didn't just take place in sanctuaries in Afghanistan, Pakistan. It relied upon meeting houses in Hamburg, flight school training centers in Arizona, and startling gaps in domestic law enforcement, all of which, now I'm not going to idealize Homeland Security here, but the operating environment is much more difficult around that now. The ease of operation is much harder. It's not the case, as it once was, that hijackers like them could pass undetected, probably, through border security 68 times and operate freely in 9 states. It's not the case that the FBI and the CIA between them are just as likely to miss 23 opportunities to disrupt the plot. So there is a sense here in which, in the dynamics of war itself and the pendulum of war, the space is enlarged through interdiction, through disruption, through restraint. As for decentralising into a globalised terrorist movement, it's true that this made bin Laden and his men and women harder to smash, but it also created great vulnerabilities of command and cohesion. It led to breakdowns within the movement over targets, methods and priorities. It meant that the likes of Abu Zarqawi arose in Iraq, causing this great blowback. Al-Qaeda's own disastrous invasion of Iraq, in fact, from Algeria to Jordan. Simply the movement lost its discipline and its cohesion. What we also see is a degradation of capabilities. It's not the case, as some alarmists argue, that one can simply pick up an education in how to become a terrorist via the internet. Terrorism, like any other military trade, is a hard-won skill. It's not simply absorbable for most people on the web. And this tradecraft relies upon practical capabilities that need experiential, hard-won knowledge drawn often from in-person training. There's a reason, ladies and gentlemen, we don't train our troops on an online boot camp, right? There are real physical group dynamics which are irreplaceable. And this is actually true across the board about communications, by the way. It may be the case that Facebook or internet or email or phones can collapse distance in terms of literal communication, but they often come at great cost in terms of real communication, in terms of real relationships. And this is also the case for practical training as well. Information technology can also have reverse effects. It can place groups on a grid to be watched and intercepted. This is something we've seen in the Arab Spring, that it can empower us, it can actually strengthen state power. And it's the case with domestic law enforcement intelligence agencies actually watching people talk to each other. And consider the state of bin Laden's actual hideout, his compound, when he was finally discovered at home. For a figure who was often spoken of as this 8-foot-tall cybernetic mastermind sitting behind encrypted software, his hideout was remarkably low-tech, right? To avoid detection, he avoided the internet, he had no phone, he relied on couriers to communicate, he only dared meet donors personally. In other words, there was not a free pathway from his headquarters to the Western Heartlands. In fact, this was not a free way at all. Against prepared defenders, it became a dangerous two-way zone of hostility where he could be hunted. Part of the difficulty here is also the assumption that failed states in themselves, or fragile states, are effective staging posts for long-range warfare. But what any competent outfit actually needs is a relatively stable, reasonably well-governed, securely governed space with decent infrastructure and a sympathetic regime, not vortexes of violence and criminality. The mere existence of some people, say, living in Somalia, for example, or Yemen, does not necessarily mean that they pose a first-order threat in terms of access. As for the threat of nuclear terrorism, which clearly deserves prudent countermeasures, there are also great geographical obstacles there as well. In fact, John Mueller, who I keep citing obsessively, sycophantically, calculates that there is a multi-20-step process from successfully obtaining higher enriched uranium to assembling a skilled team to smuggling the device in great secrecy through increasingly monitored space. So Al-Qaeda, whilst remaining, I think, a non-trivial thing, while remaining something obviously deserving of vigilance, in a sense got lost in space, at least over this period. The story is far from over, but I think that this suggests that given the nature of the space it's operating in, a more modest counter-terrorist policing, judicious raiding, disruptive raiding, whilst above all refusing to be baited by this largely mythical but powerful image of the enemy as a globalised super threat. Another case I talk about, something perhaps more pressing at the moment, is East Asia, and in particular trying to pick a hard case where you have technology and geography almost squaring off against each other. That is, one large, materially stronger power, the People's Republic of China, deploying offensive technology to try and overcome the enemy exploiting the defensive properties of terrain. And what could be a better example of that than amphibious war, right? Because that is a great geographical challenge of translating offensive invading forces from one geographical medium, the sea, onto land against resistance. Now, this, of course, can't be too precise, but what I try and offer is a sort of military estimate where I try and give the conditions as well as possible to the People's Republic of China, i.e. no American cavalry riding into the rescue, overwhelming surprise first strike from long-range artillery before a seaborne invasion. And what I argue for, even in that worst case for Taiwan, is that Taiwan would either successfully disrupt the invading forces, or at least cause China a world of pain and hurt in the process of going down. The dying sting would be very painful indeed. And there's a broader issue here about access denial, that as Christopher Lane once said, the technologies of today, because they have the capability of inflicting great violent firepower over long range, because of that, paradoxically, they actually make the world larger, because actually using that military technology for a politically effective outcome is getting much more difficult. And in a sense, conquest, at least over water, may be becoming an expensive rarity more than ever. Now, this is actually both, I think, good news and bad news for countries like the US and for China. China, if you think about it, although prodigiously rising economically, in some ways is very hemmed in geopolitically, because a lot of its smaller neighbours are also acquiring access denial technologies and also warily watching its rise. Someone's described China as actually a dragon in a bathtub for that reason. That is also bad news for a United States wanting to remain a West, if you like, a hemispheric West Asian hegemon, because in the event of China and America going to the mat, it would make its forward operating positions very vulnerable. Fighting its way back in would become increasingly complicated. Now, I'm not going to make too many ambitious predictions here. I think the US would probably prevail, but the costs are so bad potentially that they're almost unthinkable. Now, this is both a source of anxiety, but I think should also be a source of security. If it's the case that China is hemmed in, that America is hemmed in, the takeaway there is that this is an Asian security environment which is not destined to be ruled by any one power, which means that actually everyone can calm down a bit, that we need to actually look at much more sensibly at levels of collaboration and coexistence here. I don't think America as an Asian power is going away anytime soon. In fact, America, in terms of its strategic identity, has been an Asian power for a lot longer than it's been a European power in that sense. So I'm quite realistic about that. But I think there are alternatives to talking about either hegemony or going home, which is the reflex in quite a lot of at least the public debate. So in terms of access denial, what I try and argue, looking in particular at RAND's estimates, is that we live in more of an era of sea denial, that is, the ability to attack an enemy's ships, find and sink them, as opposed to an era of sea control, that is, the ability to protect ships by preventing others attacking them. It's easier to stop someone projecting power over sea than to project power itself. Now, none of this is written in stone. None of this is a law, right? Weapons don't make war themselves. It relies upon good doctrine. It relies upon paying attention. It relies upon a whole bunch of other stuff. But for a well-prepared, prudent defender with good doctrine, like I think Taiwan is showing itself to be, for example, there is great scope for actually fortifying the defensive space. So I think this can temper some of the alarm about the rise of China and some of the alarm that we could wake up one morning to find East Asia suddenly becoming effectively a Chinese domain, with other countries rolling over and appeasing it. I think that there's even good arguments for saying that what Vietnam could do in the case of a Chinese invasion, doesn't have a good history, by the way, could be quite formidable indeed. So where does this all leave us? And I also have a chapter on disruptive technologies and cyber. Very happy to talk about that in the Q&A, but I'm conscious not wanting to trespass on Austin's time. Where does this all lead us just generally? I think this is a basis. I don't try and lay out a detailed strategic program for the United States, and I do appreciate your patience in listening to someone with a foreign accent talking about your foreign policy. But now that you're in Darwin exercising, we're all Americans now in a sense. But I think this insight or this argument can be part of the basis for realising that one can afford a more restrained strategy. But what's really important here is that we get beyond this unhelpful dichotomy of global hegemony versus running home and putting your head under the bed. It's so often this obsession with tracking down isolationists or declaring that the only future is empire or nothing. I think that's part of actually the mentality of the small world itself. If you think the world is such a small place and your only choice is those two things, you're missing out both upon the vastness of the geography between you and the rest of the world, and also the intermediate choices along that path. Hans Morgenthau once talked about what the ideologies of isolationism and globalism had in common, which was this unhealthy sense of the absolute. He talked about it loses sight of, quote, that middle ground of subtle distinctions, complex choices, and precarious manipulations that is the proper sphere of foreign policy, and I think the enemy of compromise and adjustment. So I think there is scope here for recovering a geographically sensitive or geographically informed American realism, because this is really the final point, that one of the arguments made by the likes of the neoconservatives and some liberal hawks is that geographically based realism, all the things I'm saying now, are essentially suspect European importations. These are intellectually alien to the American tradition, which is about idealism, globalism, and actually rising above nature's limits. I don't think that was always the case, and I think that, like many countries, America has multiple strategic traditions intellectually, and there is a heritage of geographically informed thinking all the way from George Washington in his farewell address, talking about the importance of space and time to the Republic's growth when it was a fragile thing, all the way to the likes of George Kennan, Walter Lippmann, Hans Morgenthau, people like that. So I think there is scope here for not only recovering a geographically informed realism, but a geographically informed American realism. And the good news, I think, is that we are less powerful but more secure than we think.